So on top of this rise in Europe that we are seeing, and this militarism that we've been seeing in Europe, there is the factor of American isolationism in this very, very scary equation. Isolationism, Donald Trump and the future of the liberal order. Now, this article says that, hey, and I already read the article. This article says basically, and this is published by National Interest, this article basically says, oh, yeah, we shouldn't worry about a world war from ever happening. I think that's obvious garbage. I disagree with the author completely on this. But where I agree with this author, Gideon Rose, is when he says that America is returning back to its tradition of isolationism, and that with the rise of Donald Trump, this trend is getting stronger and stronger. Both R and D, Republican and Democrat, okay, are willing to send troops to fight for Taiwan. Okay. That is a true. I don't disagree with you that America is focusing more and more on East Asia, China. And that's why I said that America is basically telling the Europeans to be more independent, because America doesn't want to have to babysit the Europeans. And this is why the Europeans are intensifying their interest in being militarily independent. Will America go to war for Taiwan? That's the question. Will America go to war for Taiwan? Now, there's a lot of talk about America going to war for Japan, right? Because there's a deal between Japan and the United States that America will defend Japan in case Japan gets invaded. But if you actually look at the agreement between the Japanese and the Americans, take the time, it's not that long, take the time to actually read what it says in the treaty regarding America defending Japan. I did an article about this. Let me just show it to you guys. Here. Let me pull it up real quick. Hold on. So I wrote this article last year, January of 2023. I wrote this article here. Here we go, guys. So it's called "The United States Will Not Go to War to Defend Japan. The rise of Japan is inevitable because as the U.S. walks back from its position as the world's police force, the Japanese will take it upon themselves to go beyond its alliance with the U.S." Now, let me just add something. There is talk, and there has been talk in Japanese political discourse, that you cannot really trust the Americans. Now, if there's anything that we learn about the Americans, it's that you can't really trust them, right? You can't trust the Americans to defend you. Egypt was an ally of the United States. The United States supported the Muslim Brotherhood to overthrow Mubarak. America will leave its allies out to dry. There is a common belief that if a country attacked Japan, that the U.S. will enter a war to defend Japan. Right? This is a very common belief. This belief is based upon the Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security between the United States and Japan, signed in Washington in 1960. Nowhere in this treaty does it say that the U.S. is obligated to go into dire conflict for the defense of Japan. It says in Article 2 of the treaty that the parties, Japan and the U.S., quote, will seek to eliminate conflict in their international economic policies and will encourage economic collaboration between them. Okay, so I'm going to stress what I wrote up here. Nowhere in this treaty does it say that the U.S. is obligated to go into direct conflict for the defense of Japan. Now, I didn't know this until I read an article by the Japanese sociologist Jun Kitamura, and he wrote this article in 2020, and he basically said, like I said, there has been talk in Japan about why you should not trust the Americans. It's a very, very fascinating phenomena to see this because, every time we think about Japan and its relation with the United States, we think of some Japanese guys with glasses going, America-san, konnichiwa, harimasu ka, right? And we have this idea that they're just so obeisant to America. They have this docile submission to the Americans. But the Japanese people are not stupid people. They're not dumb people. They're very, very intelligent, very aware and intuitive people. And they're aware of how America is. I mean, they're the only people in history that ever got nuked. So if you ever got nuked, you would be pretty politically aware and astute as well. So this Japanese military sociologist, Jun Kitamura, said this in an article published by the Asahi Shimbun in 2020. Article 5 states that the United States must comply with the provisions and procedures of the U.S. Constitution when making a security commitment. So I'm going to read that again. Article 5. So Article 5 of the treaty between the Americans and the Japanese, the Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security. Article 5 of the treaty states that the United States must comply with the provisions and procedures. Let me make this, hold up, don't shoot. I can't breathe. Let me make this bigger for you guys. Article 5 states that the United States must comply with the provisions and procedures of the U.S. Constitution when making a security commitment. So in other words, Article 5 doesn't say, if Japan gets attacked, then we have boots on the ground. No, it says, America must comply with the Constitution when making a security commitment. That, my friends, is called the loophole. That, my friends, is called a loophole. Now, Americans love anime and they love teriyaki and they love karaoke and they love Pokemon, they love all that shit. But that doesn't mean Americans are going to be so enthusiastic about the idea of being in the middle of Okinawa with a gun, fighting some army and getting malaria. It doesn't mean that Americans are going to be enthusiastic about the idea of being in a naval ship around the Senkaku Islands. The U.S. Constitution, okay? In other words, the specific content, and this is not me writing, this is a Japanese intellectual writing. So take it from him, Jun Kitamura. In other words, the specific content of military support activities cannot be determined by the intentions of the U.S. government. I'm going to read that again. The specific content of military support activities cannot be determined by the intentions of the U.S. government, including the president, who received advice from the military. Ultimately, it will be decided by Congress. Now, look at what's been going on right now with Ukraine. We went from Polish people giving away baby cradles to Ukrainian mothers to Polish farmers basically saying screw Ukraine and don't give us that shitty Ukrainian cheap ass grain because it's going to ruin our prices. It's going to ruin our money. That's where we're at right now. We went from yellow and blue flags everywhere to Tucker Carlson interviewing Putin. And Tucker Carlson saying, are we going to go fight for Moldova? Are we going to go fight for Montenegro? Are we going to go fight for Israel? This is the rhetoric that's coming from American political discourse. So things can shift, guys. I kind of spit when I talk. I got a little excited there. Things can shift. Things can shift. At the end of the day, treaties are just paper. Treaties are only as valuable as the determination of those who agreed to them. If the party who agreed to the treaty, if just one party who agreed to the treaty does not have enthusiasm for what the treaty states, that treaty might as well just be used for toilet paper. It's paper. It is seen only as good as the advantages that it may provide. So it says here, ultimately, it will be decided by Congress. Now, look at what's been going on. If you have a war between Japan and China, do you think the American Congress will enthusiastically say, yes, let's put boots on the ground? They'll say we can give weapons. But do you think they're going to say, let's have boots on the ground in the Senkaku or some other region of Japan over this? And look at what the Republicans in Congress did recently. They blocked a bunch of money. That was not just designated for Ukraine, but it was also earmarked for the Israeli military. So you have Republicans giving the middle finger to Israel. Since when was this ever a reality? Oh, I'll tell you when. It was a reality during World War II, when you had the America First ideologues being very influential in American policy. And that's why during World War II, there were laws that were passed in the American government prohibiting American arms to be given or to be sold to belligerent nations. Because the isolationist faction in American political discourse was that influential. This was during World War II. And that is what we are heading towards. We are heading towards massive isolationism. People don't believe me. You know what? I don't blame people for not believing me because that's all we know. Right? We were born in, 1990? We were born in the late 80s. We were born in the post-World War II era. So we have become accustomed to this status quo where America runs everything. We love Israel. Could you imagine if October the 7th happened in 2001? Could you imagine? Could you imagine us dealing with 9/11 and us dealing with an October the 7th massacre in Israel in the same year? Could you imagine October the 7th, that massacre happening in 2001? John Hagee would have been speaking a fiery sermon from his pulpit. Pastors all over America would be crying out from their pulpits. People would be supporting Israel by the droves. There would be floods of support for Israel. There would have been Israeli diplomats visiting churches and doing speeches and talking to Christians and saying, "Oh, you Christians, you guys are our best ally. American Christians are our only allies. You guys are our only hope. We need you guys." Oh, you would have had all these speeches. Do you see that happening today? I remember growing up. I went to Hagee's church in San Antonio. This was back in 2006 or 2007. I went to a big event in San Antonio, and it was CUFI. CUFI stands for, CUFI is an acronym for Christians United for Israel. Okay, big pro-Israel organization. It's still around, but it's a shadow of its former self. It's all it really is. There's nothing. CUFI is really nothing in comparison to what it used to be. But I remember going to that event, and the place was the whole building. The music is way too loud. The whole building was jam-packed full of people. There were Israeli diplomats in the building. You had people from the Israeli government in the building. They had a huge screen on the wall. And on the screen appeared Netanyahu. And Netanyahu gave a speech to the church. Of course, it was pre-recorded. But nonetheless, he recorded a video just for us, just for that event. And they said, we got to raise money for Israel. We need to raise money for... It wasn't for the Israeli government. Of course not, because the Israeli government gets plenty of money. But it was to raise money for, I think, poor Jews living in Israel or something like that. And the church was able to raise $1 million. $1 million. This one church was able to raise that much money. And there was this Israeli official who came over, and there was this other Israeli guy, and he had this giant, those giant checks, basically it's a big white piece of cardboard that looks like a check, and it has the amount of money for it. It's written out just like a regular check, but it's huge. He was holding one of those, and he said, "This is how much money you guys raised, $1 million for the Jewish people. God bless you." And everybody's clapping their hands, and there was so much enthusiasm. There was so much sweat being poured out for Israel. And that came from the energy emanating from the people in favor of Israel. Where's that today? Where is that today? Where is it? It's not there. Because the world has changed. We have to admit that the world has changed, and it will continue to change. It will continue to change to our shock. Not to our comfort, but to our shock. That's how much. That's what the trajectory is telling me. So let's see here. Article 5. Okay, so we read this quote from Mr. Kitamura. So Kitamura goes on to affirm the reality that most Americans would not care to go to war for Japan. And he's right! He's right! And he said, quote, even if Japan and China had a military conflict over an uninhabited reef floating in the East China Sea, whose name most Americans have never heard of, or a tiny island about a tenth the size of Oahu, few Americans recognize that it affects American national interest. To further push the point, the treaty says in Article 10 that either Japan or the U.S. can terminate the treaty. Yeah. So everyone says, oh, we have a treaty. If Japan gets attacked, we have to go to war. The treaty says that both parties can they can both separately terminate the treaty. Quote, however, after the treaty has been in force for 10 years, either party may give notice to the other party of its intention to terminate the treaty, in which case the treaty shall terminate 1 year after such notice has been given. Well, it's been a hell of a lot longer than 10 years since the treaty was agreed upon, and that was back in 1960, so it's been over 50 years. It's been more than 10 years since this treaty was signed. This is me writing. This means that one day you could see the U.S. or Japan declare to the world that the treaty is no longer binding. If China and Japan go to war, the more likely scenario is the U.S. providing Japan with aid, weapons, munitions, intelligence, and maybe some reinforcements, not a direct military intervention. In the words of Kitamura, the United States will probably provide non-combat military support activities to Japan within a range that does not lead to a war between the United States and China. And let's be real here. China has the ability to hit us with nukes. China has the ability to hit the United States with nuclear weapons. And vice versa. So, do both of these countries want to hit each other with nukes? I don't think so. I don't think so. And, people say, well, how come America didn't do anything when Russia took Crimea? Well, there was a guy in Obama's administration who said, is America really going to go to war over Crimea? That's what this guy said. He was in the Obama administration. He said, is America really going to go to war over Crimea? Arguably, millions of people were killed under Japanese occupation. And of course, everyone who has studied the Japanese occupation of China has read about the rape of Nanking, where the Japanese butchered hundreds of thousands of people in one city. The Chinese have never forgotten about this, obviously, and the problem is that the grievances that came about from that heinous and atrocious crime have never been fully settled. They've never really been fully resolved. And the reason why is because Japan has a lot of politicians and a lot of ideologues who pushed for this idea that Japan did not do any atrocities. So there's a lot of denial that's coming out of Japan. So the hatred is still there. There's a lot of hatred there, a lot of anger. There's a lot of resentment that's there. Again, they're both competing over who's going to rule, who's going to be the big power player in Northeast Asia. Is it going to be Japan? Is it going to be China? Because let's be real here. People talk about Taiwan. The biggest players in Asia are China and Japan. Those are the biggest players. You can say India, okay, but that's basically just some giant call center, so I really don't care so much. But I'm not really interested in India, to be honest with you. Flowers of War. Yes, that was a great movie. Japan and China can't fully go to war because each country are economically entangled. Risking billions of dollars for some feelings isn't truly logical unless there's something extreme. Okay, so I've heard this argument before, that there can't be a war between China and Japan because they're both trade partners. Well, before, I think it was before World War I, Britain and Germany were trade partners.